This is First Last Chance. Chapter 18. Red light from the blood moon oozed into the portholes of Irina's cabin when she broke loose from the fire again. This time, she tumbled over onto the floor with her blanket tangled around her ankles. She still managed to get a hold of her carbine on the way down and fell onto her back with it already shouldered. No intruder had entered her cabin, and no noise had awakened her. However, she was not alone. Normally, Irina would be somewhat ashamed to be caught like this. She had certainly startled her fair share of lovers on the odd night that she managed to snag both a bedmate and a nightmare. However, considering the person laid out on the other bed was neither a lover nor a friend, she did not feel too embarrassed. Just to be sure, however, Irina let her gaze pan over to the other bed and saw that Placelle Lamella was staring back at her through foggy eyes. The huge woman looked like an exhausted imbecile, flopped onto the bed in her shift with one leg hanging down. Her hair was an even more ridiculous mess than it had been the entire time Irina had known her. Tangled and greasy. She stared back at Irina with an emotionless, slack-jawed face for a long time, before the Tribune asked in a harsh stage whisper,
"Get enough to eat off of my nightmare, did you?"
Slowly, placidly, Placelle Lamella blinked once, and closed her mouth to wet her lips before replying in a soft voice,
"It did feed me, but that doesn't mean I made you have it, or that I wanted you to."
Though she wasn't sure how much she believed that, Irina accepted it as fair enough. It wasn't like she didn't have plenty of nightmares without a heart leech around. Slowly, she sat up and carried the carbine to the wash basin to evaluate the state of the bags under her eyes. As usual, they looked awful. Irina splashed cool water onto her face and looked at herself again, almost disappointed that she wasn't able to just wash herself away. With a sigh, she opened her romper and dropped it to her ankles so she could squat over the private head and drain herself. It was extremely convenient, downright luxurious compared to the absolute state of the communal heads on Navy vessels. Still, it was impossible to fully close the door of the booth while she used it without contorting her knees, so she was compelled to stare over at Placelle Lamella some more.
"Do you like watching me piss, girl?"
she asked, not accusingly, but more conversationally, mainly to dispel her own discomfort at the way the Oathkeeper seemed to just moon about in a daze since they'd left Lortar. Irina had found her lying face down in the Sunseeker's ready room the first night while on the hunt for something to smoke. And after bringing the huge woman into her room, she had henceforth been found there at all times. It irritated Irina to no end, not just because she had grown to enjoy her privacy, but also because she had expected Arlo to take the woman back by now. The Heartleech shook her head softly.
"Not particularly."
Irina sat and just tried to finish her business after that. But while she was pulling her romper back up again, Placelle Lamella spoke once more.
"When I make water, you like watching me,"
the Oathkeeper said now, causing Irina to wince and grip her carbine a little too firmly as she recovered it.
"Do you want to watch me up close?"
"It's not like that,"
protested the smaller woman curtly.
"I don't get off on watching girls piss."
Placelle Lamella nodded and rolled over onto her side.
You just get to look at me without it meaning anything.
Irina wrapped herself in the blanket once more and faced the wall on her own bed, but couldn't help herself but say,
If you already knew, then why did you ask?
This seemed to shut the larger woman up. They sat in silence for a long while after that, Irina pretending to herself that she might be able to fall back asleep, and Placelle Lamella simply doing what she always did. It took what felt like a long time for Irina to truly understand that sleep had escaped her, as surely as she had escaped her nightmare, before she finally sat up in resignation and turned back to look at Placelle Lamella again. Lying on her side in just her shift, the Oathkeeper's shapely body was illuminated in a pinkish, silvery outline by the light coming in through the porthole above it. Irina let herself enjoy the shape for a while, and though she still had good enough sense to know better than actually inviting a soul-sucker into her bed, it was once again hard to believe Arlo had been unwilling to pillow the huge woman, after she'd worked so hard to save him. Irina had dreamed of putting hand and mouth to a dashing woman who'd just saved her life since she was a little girl. Only she'd always been the one who had to do the saving, and often that was only through use of a band of men who were much better fit for the damsel's gratitude than she was. Often still, those men considered themselves too honorable to plow a rescued wench on top of it. Some men, Irina decided, were just so ungrateful. She yawned and got to her feet so she could begin braiding her hair. She brushed it out with her hands and shook it out until it fell all around her in a thick sheet of loose brown-black curls, then separated it into 3 fat tails. She started the first braid over her left ear and worked it all the way down to the bottom, then leaned her head over and started the next braid over her right ear. Finally, she leaned back and started working the remaining hair from the middle of her head into a 3rd braid. Though the position and the way she had to contort her arms made this procedure somewhat uncomfortable, it was one of the few moments where Irina actually took the time to look at her own body instead of that of other women for a change. She was a small woman, so large breasts would have looked unusual on her, but she always felt like somehow hers were not quite big enough to please her right mind. Of course, with her chest puffed out and her back arched, she thought they looked quite lovely. They sat right up firm and pointed straight ahead. A good, honest set of tits, she thought. She was also quite pleased at how well they'd held up in these many years since she'd been burned, as she had not worn any sort of support since that horrible day. But even when she was stood naked in the mirror, the only evidence she even had of this was the sort of uneven pink discoloration of the skin that covered her right arm, shoulder, chest, and face. When she finished the 3rd braid and began working the 3 braids together into an extremely fat new braid, starting on the left and working right so it could coil around her neck at rest, Irina was actually starting to forget about her nightmare again, and this time without telling herself jokes. She hadn't been able to joke privately to herself after waking from a night terror, since Placelle Lamella had started sleeping in her cabin, out of some sense of feeling seen and ashamed that the Heartleech could sense what was happening in her secret heart. Instead of blaming the other woman like she wanted to, Irina just decided to get on with it. When she'd messed with Captain Hardwick the night before, at some point in deftly dodging the man's open and unashamed attempts to woo her, Irina had learned they would reach Hookthorn shortly after sunrise. With that out of the way, they could finally head back to Peppernuts, and the Tribune could be shrift of the whole House Harridan outfit. If she was lucky, there might even be a few cultists to put to the firing squad, and if not, at least she could return to Corvus with a feather in her cap. and collect her pay while digging around for the next toff to shake down. Irina yawned and slipped into her trousers so she could get ready for the day while casually ogling Placelle Lamella, who had just lounged gormlessly on the bed in a fashion Irina had become well accustomed to, ever since Arlo had sent the Oathkeeper packing. While the smaller woman wiggled into her slacks and stepped into her boots, she asked,
"Will you wash up, girl? You smelled during half of the best of times, but these last few days you've cultivated the odour of a gymnasium full of grunting beast-folk pigmen and pregnant fish."
The Oathkeeper looked incredibly miserable as she rolled onto her stomach and then slid off the bed. Rising to her feet, Placelle Lamella lazily began to remove her shift, but froze halfway through and asked,
"Are you going to get mad at yourself for looking?"
With her hands working a belt into the loops of her trousers, Irina's brow furrowed and she grumbled,
"Well, I probably am now that you said something. You could have just let me forget and at least get a peek before the shame set in. Blood-cursed soul-sucker that you are, at least let a woman indulge herself once in a while."
While she was grouching about it, Irina made a show of jamming her arms into the sleeves of her greatcoat and smashing her peaked cap down onto her head. The truth was that Placelle Lamella was being considerate. It was just the sort of consideration that she didn't like other people being able to have for her. There was no privacy with a heart leech. It was almost like they could read one's very thoughts. Irina may not have been as much of a prude as Arlo, but there were quite a few thoughts she preferred not to share. She started for the door in a huff, then stopped short of actually opening it, and turned around. Placelle Lamella was standing still in front of the washing booth with her hands dangling at her sides, waiting patiently for Irina to leave like a considerate little soul-sucker. Irina put her hands on her hips and took a very deep breath before finally giving in.
"All right, since you don't mind, just give us a little peek at the tits. I'd gotta know. Call it morbid curiosity. Call it emotional masochism. Either way, let's just see 'em, hey?"
Placelle Lamella wore a gentle but sorrowful smile while she reached down to the hem of her tattered and careworn shift. Irina was standing on the aft gun deck only a few minutes later, staring over the larboard taffrail at the low form of the blood moon hanging in the sky, with her hands in her pockets, while she smoked a cigarette she'd solicited from a sentry in her customary manner. It put her in a good mood, not only because it was Queen's Consort, which was her favorite brand, but also because the man seemed extremely pleased to receive his shortbread. The man shared some griping about how all the house guards had been left on Lortar, which stuck a humble rating such as himself pacing around the weather deck all night with a shotgun slung to his back. And then they parted ways in the cool night air, and Irina smoked the rest of her cigarette on the way to the forward superstructure. She descended from the weather deck after crossing to the starboard side and moved into the ship's sickbay. It was a 3-bed arrangement, though on the Sunseeker the surgeon kept an extra cot folded up on the bottom shelf of a storage closet, and chose to sleep inside in lieu of keeping a mate on station overnight. Dr. Keslow was not a man who slept well at the best of times, and often he felt that if he were to be up anyway, he might as well be doing something. This led to him napping on his cot at slow intervals throughout the day and night, but never all at once. When Irina leaned her head into the sickbay to check whether the man was at rest, she found him seated upon a locked roller stool next to an empty bed, hunched over and using it as a makeshift desk with papers spread out all around him. Even though she had been incredibly silent, sticking her head in, he turned, a balding head with enormous dome-like lenses set into a pince-nez, projecting enormous blue eyes back at her to blink a few times before the Sunseeker's surgeon thought to remove them. "Colleague, he said, still looking at Irina, though he was speaking to someone else. "Madame Rathbone has stepped in to visit us."
"Marvelous. Turn me to face her."
Professor Plurimon's voice came from the other side of the bed, where Irina had previously thought there was only a modest pile of equipment sat on top of an instrument tray. Now she realized it was the professor himself, his suspension tank and electrodes all in a heap on the tray, while Razor Skunch was laid out unmoving on one of the other beds. It was her first time seeing the two separated, and it left an odd impression, almost akin to seeing a person naked, more so than she had earlier when she actually saw a person naked. Dr. Keslow obeyed Plurimon's request and turned the instrument table, revealing to Irina that the headset device Razor usually wore was sitting upside down at a depressed angle on the table. Keslow considerately flipped it back over and tilted it back before telling Irina, "Good morning, Madam Tribune. Dr. Plurimon was just sharing with me some of his remarkable research and helping me with the bits I felt were somewhat beyond me."
"And Dr. Keslow,"
Plurimon commented in return through the blue mist that filled the headset,
"was just demonstrating how little of my work was actually beyond him, even though he bills himself as a humble naval surgeon."
Keslow simply shrugged. "I don't know about that, sir. According to the Guild, I'm only a veterinarian."
"According to the Guild, I am a war criminal,"
Plurimon shot back, and both men laughed. Keslow's laugh was much more convincing, considering that all Plurimon could manage was an unnatural sound that made Irina wonder how it was he managed to even make his voice issue forth from the mist in the first place.
"Good morning to both of you, gentlemen,"
Irina greeted once it seemed they'd finished their medical Holbert and Grisby routine. She hopped up onto the remaining bed and let her legs swing beneath her like a child's.
"I just found myself awake and thought to pop round to see if I could chat with you, Professor, and see what old gear we had to grab today. Without the house guard aboard to help, I surmise we will as like have to do it all ourselves. I don't foresee them lending us more than a few ratings, particularly as they have those men covering the watches, so far as I can see."
Keslow shut the folders in front of him on the bed and stacked them while remarking to the pile of Plurimon, "I suppose I'd better let you handle this one, colleague. I'll pop out for a smoke, shall I?" As he rose and moved past her, Irina held out a hand to block his path. When the doctor stopped, she transformed her flat, outward-facing palm to an upturned claw, and without any explanation needed, the man dropped an extra cigarette into it. Irina beamed up at him and stuck the cigarette behind her ear before turning back to the motley collection of tubes and electrodes that passed for Professor Plurimon.
"In truth, it is only a few things that really are deeply important to me,"
explained Plurimon.
"A file cabinet containing much of my work and notes over the last 15 years. A modified lifestone engine that I am using to research lifestone-bloodstone fusion and synthesis. A second modified lifestone engine I am using to research reverse charging techniques. A number of purpose-built monitoring devices required to manufacture equipment similar to that which I use to puppeteer Razor's sleeping body. Lastly, there are some small effects which are of sentimental value to me, and one large one of particularly extreme value."
Irina nodded along to the rather exhaustive list. It was fairly short, but considering that the smallest lifestone engine she'd ever seen was about the size of the washing booth in her cabin, she suspected it wasn't the sort of thing they could just carry out in a knapsack.
"What are we looking at for weight? How to get it onto the ship? Any local help? I know it's not an imperial island, but I don't suppose you were working somewhere uninhabited."
"You would suppose correctly,"
Plurimon agreed.
"The local population consists of tribalist beastfolk and council exiles. I was, at the time of my death, the only human living on the island."
Irina nodded again. ignoring how unsettled she was to hear a person refer to their own death. Not that she considered Pleurimon alive exactly, but it was hard to think of an overblown brain in a jar as living or dead. Instead of dwelling on this, she instead focused on the task itself. After the mess on Lortar, it would be nice if they could have a straightforward task.
Would the locals be willing to help get the gear?
She asked now.
I would like us to be able to turn heel fairly quick, Professor. I fear I may have left a poor taste in the mouth of the clan putting the Sunseeker's house guard on Lortar to wait for relief, and I find myself also growing somewhat tired of this particular assignment.
There was no response from the heap of equipment for a while. Irina wasn't sure whether he was thinking or just stonewalling her, but she found it difficult to ascribe any goodwill to an entity that showed no visible emotion. No stance, no bearing, no subtle cues. All the typical tools a tribune was accustomed to sniffing at were hidden in the form of Pleurimon.
Madam Rathbone, may I ask?
He began after a fashion.
Have you considered asking the Lady Oathkeeper to tell you what the crew is feeling?
Irina chuckled and shook her head.
I have not, and have no intention of it.
More silence. Then,
Are you angry that we have likely caused you to miss your opportunity to join in the siege of Redbrook Bay?
there was something of a smirk on Irina's face after hearing the question. If she was so transparent that even this person with no real eyes or ears could tell, she knew it had to be pretty obvious. But she had also asked herself the same question more than once already. Her swinging legs stopped, and she crossed her arms so she could lean back a little and think about it again.
No, I don't think so,
she eventually figured.
My stormtroopers will be there, and I imagine they are worth more than I am by heaps. What was done on Lortar was important, and it was me who pushed for it, though I do suspect our Hardwick would have likely done the same thing even if young Arlo wanted to hide in his cabin the whole time.
Pleurimon was silent for a long time once more. Finally, when Irina was on the verge of slipping off the bed and leaving, he answered her first question.
There are 2 communal lorries available on the island, and the local citizens will be more than happy to lend one to us for a small sum. They will also be happy to offer labor in exchange for the same. Hookthorn is a relatively peaceful island, and they live a generally carefree life there. They have nothing in the way of industry, and view money only as a means of acquiring trinkets and novelties from peddlers and guildsmen. Most folk are bored during the day, and have helped me with my work on many occasions. You may rely upon their assistance for a very low price.
Glad to hear it,
replied the Tribune, slipping back down to her feet and giving a slight soft clap. Irina approached the instrument table now, out of some social instinct to shake wrists or something before moving on, but found herself instead staring awkwardly down at the headset.
Should I point you at a book or something?
She asked nervously, tugging at her collar slightly.
I'm terribly sorry, mate. I've only just realised how terribly bored you must be all the time.
Don't concern yourself with my boredom, Madame Tribune,
responded the headset.
I have only had about 1.5 years to cope with my state, and I am learning new ways to interact with it all the time. With certain meditations, I can transmute myself into a world of my memories. When I perfect this technique, I may no longer even need the services of Razor Scunch, though I doubt he will release me.
Irina eyed the supine beastman on the cot for a second, then flicked her eyes back to Pleurimon and sketched a polite little curtsy.
Fair enough. I suppose I will go now and see if Mr. Implacable has started the cook fires yet, that I may have something to eat. I will fetch you directly after we make landfall, Doctor.
On her way out, Pleurimon called out to stop her at the door.
Madame Rathbone, One other thing.
She turned with her hand on the hatchway to show him her eyebrows.
I have heard it said that behind my visor, you call me Pickles.
He said now, prompting a sort of bashful smile on Irina's part. Her smile grew even wider as he added,
I wanted to tell you, I think it is quite amusing. I would permit you to call me Pickles in person, without objection.
Irina returned to her cabin, still in a fair enough mood, holding an apple tart in wax paper in one hand, and bearing an apple in her pocket, along with her customary replacement sack of shortbread. She set her goodies down upon the foot of her bed and slid out of her greatcoat with a genial,
Darling, I'm home. Put the kettle on.
This was a joke, the sort of thing she imagined telling her husband one day when he minced up to her, likely wearing some sort of fine dress, so she could subjugate him properly for the crime of being born wrong. Not that she expected Placelle Lamella to get it. The Oathkeeper hadn't responded any of the other times she'd made the crack. Still, Irina wore a little smirk as she hung her hat and coat on a peg by the bed until she turned and found the Heartleech lying face down on the other bed, sopping wet beneath a damp blanket, with tears streaming down her face as it hung over the corner of the mattress, like the limp pair of arms on either side of it. Irina frowned down at her and said,
I know, Buster Gutsworthy. But it's not that bad of a joke, girl. You're just lucky I didn't come in and smack your ass for overcooking my dinner.
Placelle Lamella did not respond to this either, except that she did snort a massive wad of snot back into her nose. Irina rolled her eyes and sat down on the bed to devour her tart, only to get less than 2 bites down before the Oathkeeper started just outright sobbing.
Fine blinking kettle of fish this is,
Irina told herself once she swallowed her second bite. She eyed the Oathkeeper with a sidelong glance, then forced down another bite of her tart. After she managed to get this one down, since Placelle Lamella was still bawling like a child, she very slowly dusted the crumbs from her shirt and into her sheets and bedspread where they belonged, before turning and narrowing her eyes over the crying woman. She inspected what of Placelle Lamella was emerging from the blanket, bare feet at the head of the bed, arms and a face soaked by tears and undried hair alike at the foot of the bed.
How old are you, girl?
Asked the Tribune. Placelle Lamella sniffed loudly, wiped her face, and said,
23.
Irina frowned.
I expected older, honestly. But it's still too old to be crying like that. They beat that out of me at the academy when I was only 16.
Placelle Lamella sniffed loudly again, and then admitted,
I haven't cried like this in a long time. My best friend Marlon died when we were 13, and I cried like this. Then again when I turned 15 and couldn't sleep with the other kids anymore.
Irina scratched her head. This thing with Arlo, a foolish little man who the girl had only just met less than 2 weeks before, just did not seem to be on the same level as those other things. Just in case she was missing something, Irina asked,
Why is it exactly that you're crying right now?
Instead of answering like a good little soul-sucker, Placelle Lamella lifted her hands and smashed them into her eyes while she sobbed more.
Is it to do with Arlo?
Asked Irina glumly. There was still no verbal answer, but at least Irina got a nod out of the huge woman this time, which gave her enough to ask,
And why is it exactly you're so bent up about Arlo?
Placelle Lamella forced herself to stop sobbing, and with a will she sucked in a deep, stuttering breath so she could say,
I don't really know. It just hurts so bad. I can feel him down the hall. I can taste how bad he's hurting right now. But I can't help him because he hates me. I feel ashamed for making him hate me, and sad I can't help him, and...
There was a long, wet, buzzing noise from the Oathkeeper's nose that set Irina's teeth on edge. Even more horrible, the big woman wiped the gobbet of snot on the back of her own arm like it wasn't just displacing slime. She moaned in sadness, then finally finished,
"And I just miss everything I left behind. I was pushed, and in the end I gave up everything to help House Harridan, and they didn't even want me. Arlo was the first person to pay any attention to me, and I ruined everything with him."
Irina sat back on the bed, tapping her chin. It suddenly occurred to her that Placella did not have to eat, which meant that nobody had to make sure she was fed. Irina had ordered food for herself in the Dawnstorm's larboard mess halls multiple times, and nobody had refused her because nobody would refuse a tribune. Irina had also seen Placella sitting patiently in the waiting room throughout the entirety of her audit of House Harridan. Nobody had ever commented on the Oathkeeper's presence. Had they even noticed her after a certain point? How long had Placella waited to be seen?
Most Oathkeepers I have met are wanderers who serve their order on the road,
Irina explained, now turning a curious gaze toward Placella.
But you, they just had lying around at your own chapel, something fit to give away to House Harridan as a gift. So, your order had no use for you for some reason. Am I right?
Placella started to cry again, which said enough for Irina. The tribune rubbed her temples and laid back on the bed with a long sigh, and surmised,
Wayward even amongst the waywards. Too wayward to be allowed to go off collecting waywards. I suppose they didn't like giving an oath to a soul-sucker after all. But I bet they had to do it anyway, because you'd never done anything wrong.
Irina finished the rest of her tart with the mournful sounds of the crying heartleech as her chamber music. Her own eyes glazed over while she tried to just retreat into herself and ignore the annoying noise. She briefly considered hanging herself in the wash-basin booth, but only really as a jest before sighing and getting to her feet. She stood over the crying Oathkeeper with her hands on her hips and an extremely dissatisfied expression for a short time before eventually just saying,
Will you promise to stop crying if I go talk to Arlo?
Placella looked back up at Irina with her eyes practically overflowing and asked,
"Are you gonna cheer him up?"
Irina wrinkled her nose and returned blandly,
Probably not.
The heartleech looked up at her miserably, but still she said,
"I'll try to stop crying, Madam Rathbone."
The tribune tilted her face into something between a smirk and a grimace while reaching down to pat the huge woman's head and tell her,
I don't like your kind. I will make no lie of it. I've been taken in by 2 different soul-suckers before, and I find myself shrift of my forbearance for you lot any longer at this point.
Then with a tortured sigh came the further confession,
But I do believe you are sincere in your own bloody stupid way. I cannot promise I will cheer up your Arlo or convince him of anything much, but I will go and talk to him, since he don't hate me yet. Don't think he loves me, mind you, but I don't think he hates me quite yet either.
The early hours of the morning saw the ship's corridors come to life. Underway, there was a steadier rhythm to life aboard than not, so when Irina emerged into the corridor, she found about half the ship's officers were milling through in their own bleary way. Rumpled gray faces and poorly ironed uniforms were being smoothed amid the smell of salt pork and buttered buns oozing from the galley above. As Irina worked her way past 2 officers in the corridor, both men gave her a respectful nod that she returned mutely. Arlo's cabin was at the end of the hall from hers, and when she arrived, she made sure to check over herself to ensure she was crumb-free and more or less the presentable, imposing shape of a tribune, before rapping twice on the door. It slid open after only a couple of beats, Arlo clearly having been seated at the desk where, in her cabin, there was a bed. The door only slid open a little, a gap not even a pace wide. Red-ringed green eyes peered out the door at her, and Irina instinctively slid the toe of her boot into the opening while leaning in to say,
"Good morning, Princeling. Are you busy at present?"
His frown filled the gap before he answered, "I'm writing a letter. Did you need something, Madame Tribune?" Of course, she could not just come out and say,
"Well, lad, I need you to take back your pet oathkeeper before I jolly well drown in her snot and tears,"
because he likely would not obey her. Irina grinned through the crack of the door and instead told him,
"I need to talk to you about Hookthorn. Spare a moment from your busy schedule to indulge your Madame Tribune, hey?"
Arlo rolled his eyes and turned away from the door without closing it. A sea of wavy raven hair filled the gap as he retreated to his desk and sat again. Irina presumed this was permission to enter, and likely would have shoved her way in somehow anyway, so she slid the door open just enough to get in before pulling it closed again behind her. The room smelled oddly sweet for one that had been occupied by a man. Irina would have expected something muskier, but in truth, her own cabin smelled worse, even before Placelle Lamella had come into it. The Tribune considered approaching Arlo to peer over his shoulder at what he had been writing, but thought better of it, and instead moved towards the bed. Again, she found herself surprised at seeing that it was neatly made already. She sat on the duvet with an upright back, and after unthinkingly moving to shift a boarding axe that wasn't present, she crossed her hands over her lap and simply examined Arlo. His face was placid, though clearly his sleep had been fitful, and his features were serene while he scanned the letter laid out on the desk. His long nose was illuminated in gold by a little brass lamp on one corner of the narrow wooden surface, casting an interesting shadow across one cheek when he turned slightly to glance at her, though he said nothing. Irina wondered briefly what Placelle Lamella had been detecting from all the way down the hall.
"Have you been having trouble sleeping?"
she asked, her tone more incidental than politely concerned. Arlo turned more fully, but just his head. He looked at her in silence for a moment, then answered, "Yes, I have been suffering." Irina nodded, then remained silent a short while longer before asking next,
"How much more have you got to write? I could come back in a few minutes."
The pen came down onto the desk a little too loudly, but Arlo seemed to regret his agitation, and he much more carefully picked it up and slid it into a small slot next to his lamp. He tilted his head just slightly a few times, then assumed a look of respectful solemnity and turned in his chair all the way to face Irina. In something of an official tone, he reported, "I have taken your advice, Madame Tribune. I have written this letter to my uncle, accepting his generous offer of a clerk's position in the counting house on the mainland. The trials of the 10,000 seas are too much for one such as I. Cousin El Royal tells me 2 men of the house guard died seizing back the refinery. I come away feeling as though whenever I am involved with something important, men die. I believe I even killed a gilder with my very hand not long ago. It is a heavy weight for me to bear, and I am now having nightly terrors in my dreams about the things I have seen and done." Irina nodded, her own face falling into polite solemnity. On the one hand, she felt sneering disgust at him for giving up. Arlo was, to her, a smart young man of able body, the kind of person who should be chomping at the bit to serve on the frontier. He was better educated than most soldiers, officers, and clan agents, a valuable trait on the 10,000 seas, not fit to be wasted on a counting house drone. By rejecting the frontier, Arlo was robbing himself from the Empire itself. On the other hand, sympathy formed a knot in her. She knew what it was like to be tortured in her sleep by the memory of the worst things in her past. Arlo's softness had its endearing qualities in and of themselves as well, for his sensitivity was also what made him care about others and stand up for them like he had Placel Lamella. Perhaps it was why the big heart leech had doted on him so. Perhaps she could, with her unnatural abilities, somehow sense that sweetness in Arlo. Either way, it at least gave Irina something to start with. She asked,
"Are you not feeling relieved by your decision? You seem troubled."
Arlo chuckled to himself pitifully and turned back to the letter. He held it up facing her as though she could read it from the other side of the washing booth and admitted, "It's true. I am very troubled. I am wounded writing this letter. I feel like this act of giving up is the last terrible event in my long tumble down a flight of stairs." He held the letter in front of himself between thumb and forefinger of each hand, bending it inwards and then popping it back out for emphasis while explaining, "My dreams are all now broken and unattainable." Irina said nothing, but gave him another solemn nod. He shrugged and returned the letter to the desk, then leaned his cheek on one upturned palm. "You probably think very little of the dreams of a selfish, spoiled rich boy, no?" he asked, then chuckled again and deformed his cheek, shaking his head into his palm. "I make no doubt of it." The Tribune wrinkled her nose slightly, but kept her eyes still.
"I dunno, shipmate. Tell me about your dreams, so we can find out."
Arlo leaned back against the opposite wall of the cabin and sighed deeply, resting his hands atop his thighs. His hair in wild black rivulets whirled down on either side of his slightly downturned face, one entire side of it cast in shadow by the harsh light of his lamp. Because he had given up on escaping the rap of being a spoiled rich boy, he indulged himself and told her everything. "When I finished school," said he, "my mother and I originally planned to open an auction house for fine art. We had this idea that we could invite small artists from throughout the empire, the sort who otherwise never get noticed, and use the Harridan name to expose these small artists to military officers, high priests, committee officials, ministers, and of course, limiters. You no doubt know by now that she was killed at the end of my first year. My family home and her collection were also destroyed in the process, meaning not only did I lose the only person who truly cared about me, but I lost the means to start my life at the same time." Irina took off her hat now and set it next to her on the bed. She crossed her legs as well, carefully slipping out of her greatcoat. He watched her, not really taking much interest in the act, but Irina wanted Arlo to see her in this vulnerable moment as herself, and not as a tribune. "After university, I was lucky to be appointed governor of Lost Pips Rock due to my family connections. I believe House Harridan's info chandler solicited letters of recommendation from very highly placed people," he went on. "I was able to begin work on rebuilding a collection of sorts, thanks to the support of a lovely woman by the name of Valentina who I met at a gala on Viola. The thing is..." He stopped to chuckle again and blushed, looking down at his own feet. "Last I heard anything of her, she was piling every valuable I owned into my personal vessel and leaving Lost Pips Rock without even waiting for me. I confess I was surprised, even though I shouldn't be, considering my luck with women. Irina nodded at that comment, more out of empathy due to her own luck with women. She also had her fair share of dealings with enchanting huckstresses, never mind that she had spent much of her early life thinking that was only the sort of thing that happened to men. She scooted back on the bed so she could lean on the wall, trying to banish her desire for a cigarette since Arlo so rarely smoked, and merely said,
"Don't I know it? What some women folk are like."
No, Arlo said now, raising a hand and chuckling even more forcefully. You really don't understand. Let me tell you, the first love of my life was a girl I played with in the streets of El Hassan as a little boy. On my 14th birthday, we snuck off to a place we thought was secret, where she and I made love upon the beach like true lovers of old, though we were so young.
"Touching tale,"
Irina commented. "Until her father caught us in the middle of it," Arlo blurted next with his hands balling as fists. "Some person told him where we had gone off to, as it was not so secret as we believed, and when he found us he beat me savagely. He held me by my hair and kicked me over and over again until the hair he was holding was torn out." Here, Arlo had to take in a deep breath and spread his hands out like he was pushing the memory away from himself. Then continued, "My father, the great Melmir Sarakidan Harkon, the Glass Prince of El Hassan they called him by this point, for he was very big in the business of glass. My father had this man beaten in public, even worse than I was, and wrote to his employer to have him fired. I'm sure you know I never saw that girl again after, and in fact, no other girl on the island would even look at me after. Who would want to love a boy whose father would destroy your life?" Now, Arlo held out the fingers of his hand to count this girl as the first in a string he related. "So, we have the girl I loved whose father beat me and was overpunished for it, the one who stole my boat and collection while leaving me to die, and now let me also tell you that I had a lover at school who I caught in our bed with her very own brother of all people." He tapped a fourth finger and hesitated, then sneered at Irina and finished, "And of course, you will love to know that I at one time became besotted with a prostitute, a whore who made fun of me and bullied me because I spent my load too soon to be inside her." But Irina did not laugh. But not because it wasn't funny. She didn't want to tell Arlo that she had spent many of her early years being raised by whores in a whorehouse, and they had a million jokes about the punters that would have made what hairs hadn't been tugged out of the princeling's head fall out on their own or turn stark white. The main reason Irina didn't laugh, however, was because she felt deeply sad for Arlo. She could see why he was scared to move on Placelle Lamella. Why he wasn't the chuffed-up, arrogant, womanizing brat she had thought him to be originally. She could also relate to his woes.
"You think that's bad?"
she said, crossing her legs beneath her, unconscious of how her boots were getting on his bedspread, mimicking his list of fingers and the way he had tapped each finger while she went down her own horrible list.
"The first girl I loved used me to subvert an investigation into cult activity. Fact. And also, I let her into a secure bunker thinking we would shag, and she used that to let her buddies in to kill everybody else. Also fact. Finally, she and her Cownoid mates killed everyone I knew, including the first and only man I ever loved, who I cheated on with her. How's about that, shipmate? You think you've had rotten luck with women? I can top you by having had worse luck with one and been one all in one go."
She was crying now, in spite of herself, having more intended the story to be funny than so miserable and self-exposing. Still, she beamed miserably at Arlo and used her palm to wipe the tears away from her cheek before saying,
"I'm sorry, lad. I meant that to be funnier."
Arlo smiled weakly back at her. My heart goes out to you, Madame Tribune. But it just goes to show that I am made of weaker stuff than you. That's why I'm going ahead and sending this letter as soon as I'm finished with it. So Uncle Tristan can make the arrangements for me, even if it means I must give up on my mother's dream. He sighed while turning back to the desk and lifting the letter again, then added, and I suppose I would also be giving up on the chance I might have something with a girl I met recently as well. A shame. I will miss the opportunity to be heartbroken by or ruin a beast girl's life. Not many Korovokians get the chance to do that, yes? Irina kept it to herself that there were droves of girls who would paddle out through the dockwaters around Glevenstown from both of the local beastfolk tribes of Sneaking Dog and Hopping Hare that would clamber up into an imperial vessel and clean out the men aboard within an hour of landfall. She also kept it to herself that there were sometimes young men among the girls, or that some sailors even went so far as to prefer girls of extremely deep levels of mutation, that some Korovokian sailors had beastfolk wives, and a few of those women were practically anthropomorphic. Arlo would not be able to appreciate this information, she thought. At least not at present. Still, the Tribune got to her feet and crossed over to Arlo. She extended her hands, and when he took them, she helped him to his feet as well, so she could wrap her arms around his waist and hug him. Because of his relative height, she felt like she was a little girl again, pressing her cheek against his chest and spreading her fingers over his back and twining them through his voluminous hair while he stood there aghast. Slowly and uncertainly, Arlo relented to the hug and wrapped his arms around her shoulders as well. She could feel him almost deflating onto her once he got past the extreme surprise that it was her, of all people, who was offering this comfort. They stood there embracing for a long time, before she finally said, her face still pressed against his chest,
I won't tell you what to do, Arlo, even though I am allowed to by law, but I think that you should not send that letter if it feels like giving up. Just my opinion, shipmate.
Arlo petted down her braids and rested his chin on her scalp, squeezing her more tightly than she thought he would. It was as though he was greedily sucking up every single drop of this rare affection the Tribune was offering him. And because she wanted him to know it was sincere, she let him without complaint. When they finally parted, she looked up at him with a gentle smile that made him blush, which transformed said smile into a catty smirk.
Don't blush, lad,
she told him cutely.
I'm not worth it.
First Last Chance was written by B.E. Lunatois and is narrated by the author. The effect of some characters' voices is achieved using 11 Labs speech-to-speech voice changer software. All Foley and soundscapes were created from audio in the public domain, or released under a Creative Commons Zero license. The voice of Irina Rathbone was modeled on recordings submitted by Alicia Cranford. Lastly, and most importantly, thank you for listening or reading.